Ojo, Osiang Shana Vaninga. Osiang Shana Vaninga. Ojo, Osiang Shana Van. Osiang Shana.
You know, some people would not believe that cannibalism ever occurred, but it certainly occurred in this part of the country, in the eastern part of southern Africa, in Natal. And there are many instances of this. We know, for example, that the first cases of cannibalism in this part of the world, at least the documented cases, related to a group of Portuguese sailors who ate a black man near Sibaya. We also know that during the time of the Sharkin era, when the Zulu nation was being consolidated, cannibalism was rife in the area of the Biggersberg. We know many cases of cannibalism that occurred in Lesotho. Cannibalism even occurred in the Valley of 1,000 Hills, quite close to Durban. We know that there were some horrifying examples of cannibalism, such as the case of the chief known as Matiwani, who used to rip the gallbladders out of the living victims so that he could in fact suck the power of the gall. In some way this gave him more power himself over his enemies. You know, it's a very difficult thing to understand. We're going to go on a bit of a voyage of exploration of the phenomenon of cannibalism in this part of the world. We're going to have a look at it and see whether we can understand why it occurred. Some people might think that it occurred only on account of a need for food. And certainly in times of social stress, it seems, cannibalism was more prevalent. But there could be other reasons. We will perhaps show you examples of cannibalism where the sheer cruelty of the act might have been the main thing. And yet, you know, if you think of people wanting to cannibalize because of sheer brutality, you also have to take into account that from Lesotho has come the record of cannibals saying that their victims are in fact like cows or like eland. In other words, the victims were reduced to the status of an animal. Was that in fact to make a horrifying act a little more palatable? Now here on the coast of Natal at Mhlanga Rocks is a shell midden. And this shell midden was in fact a very important source of food for black iron workers in this area for about 400 years. They were here from about the 6th to the 10th century. In fact, this whole coastline is alive with food if you know how to get it. But sadly, during our history, a great many Portuguese ships were wrecked off this coast, and the Portuguese communities who tried to move up, usually to Delagoa Bay, had an awful time of it. They suffered great privations, as was the case with the Saint Benedict or São Bento in 1554. The São Bento was wrecked off the Cape Coast, and the Portuguese company, the sailors and the passengers tried to work their way right up this coast to get to Delagoa Bay, because they knew that at Delagoa Bay a ship called in every June of each year. They had an awful time. They encountered hostile tribes, they had to fight their way past wild animals, and a great many of them lost their lives. But one of the things that nagged at them was hunger. As they moved up here, they were starving. By the time they'd got more or less to the present port of Durban, these people decided to send 4 of their sailors to the north to try and get to Delagoa Bay, to say that the rest of the community was coming up the coast. These sailors made their way forward, leaving the company behind. By the time they got to more or less St. Lucia, they had run out of food and they were starving. They were down to their last piece of stinking shark's flesh and their last few lizards. And when they got around the area of Lake Sabaya, they couldn't control themselves anymore, and they killed and cannibalized a local man. Now what happened then was that the rest of the local communities, horrified at what had happened, killed the 4 Portuguese sailors in turn. And when the company came up the coast, they got to Sabaya, the local people explained to them what had happened. Your sailors killed and ate one of our people, they said, and so we killed them in turn. And it shows that under extreme duress like that, even people who might have a very strong background, which one would perhaps think would not lead them to do something like this, could give way to hunger and could commit the atrocity of cannibalizing someone. 30 kilometers inland, not far from here, is the Valley of 1,000 Hills. In the old days it was very different to what it is today. In those days it was the haunt of cannibals. That rather austere and dark-looking rocky mass behind me over there is known as Mfecane. We Westerners would call it the Table Mountain. Now a very interesting story is told here about a young Nyavo prince by the name of Mfecane. Once Shaka's armies had moved into here and people were reduced to cultivating a few vegetables in the bush, young Mfecane and his mother and a few other people were busy with their cultivation when they were captured by the cannibals. As they were led away to a rather horrible death, young Mfecane managed to break free and he ran downhill to the Mzanduzi River with the cannibals in pursuit. He got to the river and he hurled himself into the water in about the deepest pool that he could find. And the cannibals never followed him because they were wary of the crocodiles that still existed in these parts. So young Mfecane was against the reeds, shivering and shaking, with his parents, his mother being taken away to a horrible death, but his own life was saved. Even the great landmass known as the Bluff, near the modern city of Durban, was known for cannibalism, and so was the area around it. And the story is told of a group of Zulu warriors coming into a glade somewhere in the area of the Mhlatazana River, which is near Durban. And as the warriors came into the glade, they saw a number of people there, and of course these people scattered as the young warriors walked into the opening. And they saw a cooking pot there, and there was the smell of the cooking of meat coming from the pot. And they came up to the pot very, very hungry and very excited about what they were going to find. But when they looked into the pot, they found a collection of human arms and legs. And those young Zulu warriors turned the pot over and they scattered in a way that they would never have done in the face of an enemy. Here I am standing in this beautiful valley in KwaZulu-Natal, and I must confess to feeling very mixed emotions. On the one hand, above me here, I see the power lines carrying electricity from the Transvaal down to KwaZulu-Natal. They are crackling and humming and buzzing with life, and they're bringing hope to millions of people in this province. But when I look a little further down the slope, and I see those rather innocent rocks at the back there, I feel the other emotion, because that rock is Iche Lama Zimu, and that is the rock of the cannibals. And that rock brought death in this area to hundreds of people. The Amabele lived in this region, and their chief was an ogre by the name of Flupalule. Now Flupalule was very closely identified with this rock, Iche Lama Zimu, the rock of the cannibals. And he would have his victims brought to this rock as tribute. He never asked for cattle or goats. He wanted human beings, and the reason he wanted them was because he was a cannibal. Now can you imagine the feelings of a family brought here, taken to the top of the rock, and each family member then hamstrung by being cut behind the heels so they couldn't escape? And do you know that when the people were on top of this rock, the children of this neighborhood would throw stones at them to add to their torment. And finally, one of those family members would be selected at the pleasure of Hlupelule, and they would be taken down and they would be executed and cooked and then eaten. The rock that I'm standing on is the actual butcher's block used by the cannibals. There's no doubt about this. The evidence is right here for you to see. If one looks carefully at the rock, one notes parts of it where knives have been sharpened. The evidence is here, and if you look carefully, you will again see where knives have been sharpened on the surface of the rock. But you know, what makes this whole thing even more shocking is the fact that the people who were killed here were killed in full view of the rock at the top, and their friends and their families up there could have seen the butchery taking place. And this absolutely numbs one's mind. And underneath here, this crevice, is where Hlupelule, the chief, used to while away his time between meals. But for me, what is also very interesting about this is that old Otto Klingenberg, the owner of this farm, Freiberg, once very carefully excavated away a pot here that was identified with human remains. Now, how do we know all this? We know it because in 1905, Otto Klingenberg had an interview with an old man of this region by the name of Magoba. And Magoba related to him all of the events of Ichelamazimu and the cannibals. Now, I suppose it was in about 1827 or so that Shaka eventually sent Jobe Setole and some of his herders into this region. Of course, it put great pressure on the Bele tribe under their chief Hlupelule. Hlupelule operated from Ichelamazimu, the rock of the cannibals, across the valley there. And of course, he found that there was more and more pressure and encroachment from the herders. And he then had to move his kraal from the vicinity of that rock, and he moved to the north. But he even moved further from there and went on to the farm Culverfontein, which is presently owned by Mr. Foyfermark, and that's very much further to the north and the west. Now, Hlupelule might have moved, but of course the herders were also moving as well. And they then crossed the Biggersberg to the west, and they then started to herd the royal cattle in the Toleni Valley. Now, I think it's rather important that we go to Foyfermark's farm and have a look and ask him if he can try and identify for us where the cannibal kraal would have been situated. It's early in the morning and we're on the farm Culverfontein. With me I have the farm owner, Mr. Foyfermark. Now, we're actually at the start of the cannibal trail on the farm. Now tell me, Foy, why do you have a cannibal trail here?
A couple of years ago we developed the hiking trail and we were looking for a name for it, and we decided to use the name Cannibals Hiking Trail, as this hiking trail passes the places where the cannibals used to live, or where the chief Sangove had one of his calls. And that is roughly 4 kilometers away from here on the rim of the escarpment.
All below me is the escarpment which falls away to the Toleni Valley. In the far distance one gets a view of Jobe's Kop, but directly behind me here and slightly below me is a rocky outcrop which obscures anything behind it in the little ravine below me. Now, according to the testimony of Magoba, it is likely that Hlupelule's third kraal, his third umuzi or homestead, would have been somewhere below this escarpment. It is quite possible that the signs of human habitation just 150 meters from me down there could have been the homestead or part of the homestead of Hlupelule. The rocks are down there, there are crumbling rocks, there's a little grove of trees that's grown through them. I suppose the seeds would have been protected from fire. And also directly below me here is a somewhat bigger homestead. Boy, one or two things that I need to ask you. I understand that the first major clash between the cannibals under Hlupelule and the herdsmen under Sandlovo occurred some here in the Tuleni Valley. I also understand that 6 of the herders were killed and were in fact eaten. 2 of them, from what I understand, were hunted down by dogs. Now, can you elaborate on that? Can you tell me more about where it happened and what the circumstances were?
Yes, Alec. After Mashupalele was observed by Sandlove and Jobo Sitole near the Cannibal Rock, he became jittery and he moved to this site and established himself in this area here. And at the same time, Sandlove moved to the base of that sharp-pointed mountain in the distance there. And so the two gladiators basically had a full view of each other's doings. The herdman brought the king's cattle, which was sent with Jobo Sitole to the valley in between where they grazed them. And at the same time, the herdman would also wander and look for honey, etc. And on one of those occasions, they came into conflict with the cannibals, of which 6 of them were murdered, and the others were obviously hunted down at a day or so later.
Now, Foy, there's just one last thing I need to ask you, and I understand that just somewhere up the top here, there's an interesting little cove in amongst some rocks where people might have hidden if they were under attack. Can you tell me something about that? Or can we go and see it?
Yes.
Now, of course, because of the nature of cannibalism, cannibals could very well have been under attack from their neighbors, and they would need a secure place to go to hide. And the sort of place we're in now, with these rocks looming over us and the vegetation casting a sort of gloom around this area, would have been a lovely, very, very useful place of refuge. And then just look behind me here at these caves. In the dolerite cliffs of this area, there are a great many caves like this. And this cave, which is very close to Hlupalule's kraal, was no doubt at some time used as a place of refuge. Now, as you heard from Foy Vermaak, this whole business came to a tremendous climax, and 6 of the herders were killed and eaten. Sandlove was, of course, furious, and he tried a rescue mission, but it failed, and all he found was the remains. And Sandlove then sent to Shaka to tell him exactly what had happened. When the messenger arrived, he found that Shaka was dead, and Dingaan was newly on the throne. Now, Dingaan decided that he was not going to accept these events, and in fact he sent his army into this area. He sent the right horn way to the north around Wakkerstroom and instructed them to come down the Drakensberg. The left horn, also the younger troops, were sent across Kranskop around that area, over the Tugela, and they came up through Moy River. And the 2 groups then met in the Drakensberg and swept into this area from the west. And steadily they pincered the cannibals in this region. They actually sent a message through to Sandlove: get the royal herds out of here, get your herd boys out of the way, the army is coming. And from the west, when you see the game running from west to east, you'll know we're here, we're coming. Now, it's quite possible that with the Zulu army coming into this area, they would have come to the riverside here, they would have perhaps sat down on some of these rocks, rested a while, and with a rock like this, they could very easily have taken a bit of the water and simply splashed it onto the rock, and then with their spears they would have sharpened their spears on these very grooves that you see on the rock down here. These grooves are evidence of the bloody clash that followed. The army swept into the region and annihilated the cannibals, and hardly a soul was left alive in these blood-stained valleys. Now, when we consider the evidence relating to cannibalism and whether it in fact occurred, we note that there is a considerable body of written evidence. In fact, some of it is right here in the Tulana Museum. I'm speaking to the curator, Pam Mfecane, and I'm going to ask you 1 or 2 questions about cannibalism. Pam, we've had a look at your exhibit there, but could you say just a few more words about that exhibit, and could you say something about cannibalism in general?
Cannibalism is one of the themes we've identified in this museum because it was prevalent in this area. And this is the particular area we're referring to, not far from Dundee, Job's Kop, Yellowscroll Valley, Mfecane, Washbank Valley. And it came about a couple of years ago when one of the local farmers contacted us to know whether we were aware of these caves or that he had relics from them, pieces of pottery, pots, skulls. And then we did some research into the whole thing. And it must now be 15 years ago that we went down into the valley, looked at the sites which the elderly people identified for us with some of the elderly black people, and then opened the caves. We unblocked the rock walls that reputedly had been sealed on Dingaan's orders in 1828, and went into those caves, and those skulls and some of the pottery which you see on display here came out of those caves, together with stuff which the local farmers had collected.
Now you say that Dingaan in fact ordered the caves to be walled up, and my understanding is that both Shaka and Dingaan in fact wanted to stamp cannibalism out, and that the Zulu royalty never at any time supported this particularly horrible practice. Could you comment on that?
I think that's a perfectly valid comment. It was offshoots of tribes who didn't want to be incorporated into the Zulus, who had taken refuge in mountainous areas and resorted to cannibalism simply as a way to keep alive.
So some of it really was motivated by necessity.
By necessity,
By
very
need
much
for
so.
food. Horrifying nevertheless.
I'm examining one of the skulls in the Tulana Museum. There's something in particular that interests me, and that is that the whole of the frontalis bone, to be technical about it, has been removed. One has to ask the question why. Now, if this damage had been caused by, let's say, a hyena, or perhaps a leopard, I believe they would have crushed the whole of the skull case. It is possible, of course, that the damage could have been caused by a knobkerrie blow. But how do you wield a knobkerrie in a shallow cave? And that is exactly where these skulls had been found. Now this cooking pot, which is part of the cannibal exhibit again in the Tulana Museum, is of interest, because if ever human bones were to be found in one of these pots, it would be very compelling evidence indeed. And that is exactly what I understood happened with old Mr. Klingenberg at Itche Lama Zimu. Underneath the butcher block, down the hill, he excavated a cooking pot, something like this, and in fact he found human bones identified with it. Now that is some of the strongest evidence I think you can actually find anywhere for the presence of cannibalism in this region. In fact, as late as 1961, the Help Mekaar Jackal Club went into one of the caves somewhere in the Isibindi Valley, and in fact they pursued the jackal into the cave, and there they found cooking pots here, and in fact human remains identified with them. It is of course based on oral evidence, and regarding the oral evidence we have the testimony of people like Magoba and of course Foy Vermaak. And when we start considering sort of practical evidence such as this skull, then it becomes very, very compelling indeed. One wonders whether in fact cannibalism could really happen in the present day. And we have a number of recent cases that prove that it can. There was the plane crash in Peru where the bodies were eaten, and of course we have the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. And that certainly gives one food for thought. How is it possible that one human being can in fact kill and eat another? Now, as we've shown, it might be because of sheer necessity to survive. It could also be because of magical reasons, or it might be because of the sheer love of the horror of the thing. But whichever explanation is right, one must agree that this veneer that we call civilization is very thin indeed.